Young farmer donates harvest to food banks, annually not realizing a recipient would buy his mortgaged land to gift back. This was the story of Mason Reed's life, though he didn't know it yet as he stood in his fields at dawn, calloused hands running through the soil he might soon lose. The October morning bit with early frost, painting the world in shades of silver and gold. Mason's breath clouded before him as he surveyed the last of the season's harvest. Rows of pumpkins, squash, and late tomatoes stretching across 5 acres of the 30 he had left. Not enough to save the farm, but enough to feed others. Always enough for that. He knelt, pressing his palm flat against the earth. 27 years old, and the land still spoke to him the way it had when he was a boy trailing after his father. The dirt beneath his fingernails felt like home, in a way the farmhouse, with its stack of mortgage notices on the kitchen table, no longer did. "Looking good this year, son," came a voice behind him. Mason turned to see Thomas, the 60-something farmhand who'd worked for the Reeds since before Mason was born. The old man's face was weathered as the barn boards, eyes crinkling at the corners, with a lifetime of squinting into the sun. "Not good enough," Mason replied, his voice low and rough from disuse. Living alone on 200 acres meant conversation was a luxury, like new tractor parts or a roof that didn't leak. Thomas sighed, his boots crunching through the frost-tipped grass as he joined Mason at the edge of the field. "Your father would be proud, you know, of the donations." Mason's jaw tightened. His father wouldn't be proud of much else. Not the mounting debt, not the second mortgage, not the foreclosure notice that had arrived yesterday, giving him 90 days to make good on payments 3 months overdue. "Pride doesn't pay the bank," Mason said, but there was no bite to his words. Just resignation. "No," Thomas agreed, "but it feeds the soul, and you're feeding a whole lot of people." Mason nodded and straightened, stretching his back. He'd been donating a quarter of his harvest to regional food banks for 5 years now, ever since his parents' accident. It was the one promise to his mother he hadn't broken. "Truck's coming at noon," he said, glancing at his watch. "Better get the crates ready." They worked in companionable silence, loading wooden crates with vegetables, the scent of earth and autumn filling the crisp air. Mason's hands moved with the certainty of someone who had done this work since childhood. Efficient, almost tender in the way he handled each squash, each pumpkin. Every piece of produce was a small miracle to him, a collaboration between his labor and something greater. When the food bank trucks arrived, Mason watched the volunteers load up with a quiet ache in his chest. This might be the last year, the last harvest, the last gift he could give from land that had been in his family for 4 generations. "Mr. Reed?" A woman with a clipboard approached him, her red hair bright against the muted autumn landscape. "I'm Sophia Kane from Heartland Community Services. I just wanted to personally thank you. Your donations feed hundreds of families every year." Mason nodded, uncomfortable with the praise. "Just doing what needs doing." "Well, it matters," she said, her green eyes serious. "More than you know." If only she knew how close he was to losing it all, Mason thought. But he kept his silence, offering only a tight smile as she returned to the trucks. That night, after Thomas had gone home, Mason sat at the kitchen table with a calculator, a legal pad, and a growing sense of despair. The numbers never changed, no matter how many times he reworked them. Too much debt, too little income, too many years of drought and bad luck. The refrigerator hummed in the corner, a sound that had been the backdrop to his entire life. Mason rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of failure pressing down on his shoulders. His father would have found a way. His grandfather would never have let things get this bad. Mason stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness where his fields lay sleeping. He pressed his forehead against the cool glass and closed his eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the land, to his ancestors, to himself. The next morning he rose before the sun, as always. The routine of farm life continued regardless of foreclosure notices or broken dreams. Animals needed feeding, fields needed tending. Life went on, even when you weren't sure how. As November turned to December, Mason threw himself into preparations for winter. He fixed fences that didn't need fixing and reorganized tool sheds already in perfect order. Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from wandering to the inevitable. On a Tuesday afternoon, with snow threatening in the heavy clouds overhead, a black sedan turned onto the long driveway leading to the farmhouse. Mason watched from the barn, wiping grease-stained hands on a rag. Visitors were rare and rarely brought good news. A woman emerged from the car, bundled in a camel-colored coat that looked expensive even from a distance. Her hair was hidden beneath a knit hat, but something about the way she moved seemed familiar. "Mr. Reed?" she called, spotting him in the barn doorway. Mason stepped out, squinting against the gray light. "That's me." As she approached, recognition dawned. The food bank woman, Sophia. Up close, her eyes were even greener than he remembered, like summer leaves against her pale skin. "Sorry to drop in unannounced," she said, her breath clouding between them. "I tried calling, but phone's been out," Mason admitted. Another bill he couldn't afford. She nodded, seemingly unsurprised. "I was hoping we could talk. About the farm." Mason's stomach nodded. "Not much to talk about." "I think there is." Sophia glanced at the darkening sky. "Mind if we go inside? Looks like snow's coming." The kitchen felt smaller with her in it. Mason hurriedly cleared the table of bills and papers, embarrassed by the peeling wallpaper and the dripping faucet he'd been meaning to fix. He put on coffee because that seemed like the thing to do, though his hands shook slightly as he measured the grounds. "So," he said when they were seated across from each other, mugs steaming between them. "What's this about?" Sophia wrapped her fingers around her mug, as if drawing warmth from it. "I'm not just with the food bank, Mr. Reed." "Mason," he corrected automatically. "Mason?" She smiled, and something in his chest eased a fraction. "I'm also a researcher. I've been documenting the impact of small farm donations on food insecurity in rural areas. Your contributions have been significant." He shrugged, uncomfortable. "Anyone would do it, but they don't," Sophia said simply. "You do, and I'd like to understand why." Mason stared into his coffee. The real answer was complicated, tied to a deathbed promise, to generations of Reed family values, to his own need to give something pure in a life increasingly tarnished by failure. "My mother believed no one should go hungry when we have plenty," he said finally. "Even when we don't have plenty, there's always something to share." Sophia studied him, her eyes thoughtful. "And now? I understand the farm is in some trouble." Mason's head snapped up. "How did you—" "Public records," she said gently. "Foreclosure notices are filed with the county." Shame burned through him, hot and sharp. He stood abruptly, taking his mug to the sink, though it was still half full. "So what? You came to see the failing farmer before he loses everything? Take some notes for your research?" "No," Sophia said, her voice steady. "I came because I might be able to help." Mason laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet kitchen. "Unless you've got $300,000 in that fancy coat, I doubt it." Sophia didn't flinch. "What if I told you there's an investor interested in saving small farms like yours? Someone who believes in what you're doing and wants to help you continue." "I'd say nothing comes without strings," Mason replied, crossing his arms. A lifetime of disappointment had taught him to distrust easy solutions. "Fair enough," Sophia nodded. The string would be a commitment to continue the donations, and perhaps expand them if possible. Mason frowned, leaning back against the counter. Why would anyone invest in a failing farm just to give food away? Because some people believe food security matters. Because your donations have directly impacted hundreds of lives. She paused, something flashing across her face too quickly for Mason to read. "Would you be open to meeting with the investor? Hearing them out?" Hope was a dangerous thing. Mason had learned to live without it, to expect the worst and be grimly satisfied when it arrived. But something in Sophia's earnest expression made him hesitate. "When?" he asked finally. "Tomorrow?" They're eager to see the operation before making a final decision. Mason glanced out the window. The first snowflakes were beginning to fall, dusting the brown fields with white. Tomorrow was as good a day as any to grasp at straws. "Fine," he said, "but I won't be signing anything without my lawyer looking it over." Sophia smiled, relief evident in the softening of her shoulders. "That's perfectly reasonable." As she stood to leave, Mason noticed how the kitchen seemed to dim slightly with her motion toward the door, as if she'd taken some of the light with her. "One more thing," she said, pausing with her hand on the doorknob. "Would you mind if I brought a photographer tomorrow? This could be a great story for our annual report." Mason almost said no. He hated having his picture taken, hated the idea of being some charity case in a glossy brochure. But he thought of the food bank trucks, of the families who would go hungry if he lost the farm. "If it helps," he conceded. After she left, Mason stood at the window watching her taillights disappear down the long driveway, red smudges against the gathering darkness. The snow was falling harder now, erasing tire tracks and footprints, covering the world in clean possibility. For the first time in months, he slept without dreaming of loss. Morning arrived with 6 inches of fresh snow and a clarity to the air that made Mason's lungs ache as he completed his chores. He'd woken early, driven by a restless energy he couldn't explain. By 9, he'd fed the animals, cleared the driveway, and even shaved, something he rarely bothered with in winter. Thomas arrived at 10, eyebrows rising at the sight of Mason's clean-shaven face. "Special occasion?" The old man asked, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. Mason briefly explained Sophia's visit and the mysterious investor. Thomas listened with a skeptical expression that mirrored Mason's own doubts. "Sounds too good to be true," he said when Mason finished. "Probably is," Mason agreed. "But what's the harm in hearing them out?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Your father would say the same. The comparison should have stung, but today it didn't. Today, with snow blanketing the fields and the possibility, however remote, of salvation, Mason felt something like his father's son again. At precisely noon, 2 vehicles turned onto the property. Sophia's now familiar sedan, and behind it, a large black SUV with tinted windows. Mason and Thomas stood on the porch, watching as they parked. Sophia emerged first, followed by a young man with a camera slung around his neck. From the SUV came a tall figure in a long dark coat, face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. "Mason?" Sophia called, waving as she approached. "Thank you for meeting with us today." Mason descended the porch steps, extending his hand first to Sophia, then to the photographer who introduced himself as Ben. Finally, he turned to the figure in the dark coat. "Mason Reed," he said, offering his hand. The figure removed the hat, revealing a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked dark hair and eyes that seemed to look straight through him. "Eleanor Lawrence," she said, her handshake firm and brief. "I've heard a great deal about you, Mr. Reed." The name triggered a distant memory, but Mason couldn't place it. "All good, I hope." "Exceptional, in fact," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "Shall we tour the property? I'd like to see what I might be investing in." For the next 2 hours, Mason led them around the farm, explaining his operation with growing animation. Despite his initial reservations, he found himself wanting Eleanor to see the potential. Not just what the farm was, but what it could be with proper funding. He showed her the fields where he rotated crops to maintain soil health, the small orchard he'd planted 3 years ago, the barn he'd retrofitted for more efficient storage. Throughout it all, Ben's camera clicked steadily, capturing images Mason couldn't imagine anyone finding interesting. Eleanor asked pointed, knowledgeable questions about yield, water management, and equipment needs. She didn't seem like a dilettante playing at philanthropy, but someone who understood agriculture. "And this is where you sort the donations?" she asked as they entered the east barn where crates were stacked from the last harvest. "Yes," Mason nodded. "We separate everything by type, check for quality. Nobody gets the seconds. Food bank folks deserve the best, same as paying customers." Something flickered in Eleanor's expression. "That's unusual. Most commercial operations donate only what they can't sell." Mason shrugged. "That's not how my mother saw it. Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Mason said simply. They ended the tour in the kitchen, where Thomas had prepared a simple lunch of soup and fresh bread. As they ate, Eleanor continued her questions, now focused on Mason's vision for the farm's future. "If money were no object," she asked, stirring her soup thoughtfully, "what would you do differently?" Mason considered the question. It had been so long since he'd allowed himself to dream beyond survival. "I'd expand the greenhouse operation," he said finally. "Extend our growing season, offer more variety year-round. Maybe add some educational components. Get local schools involved. My mother was a teacher before she married my father. She always thought farms should be classrooms too." Eleanor nodded, something softening in her sharp features. "And the donations? Would you continue those?" "Of course," Mason said without hesitation. "That's non-negotiable." A smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Good answer." She set down her spoon and looked directly at Mason. "Mr. Reed, I'll be frank. I'm prepared to offer you a substantial investment in exchange for a minor stake in your operation. You would maintain control, but I would provide the capital to clear your debts and fund the expansions you just described." Mason's heart hammered against his ribs. "Why?" "Because what you're doing matters," Eleanor said simply. "Small farms are disappearing at an alarming rate, and with them goes food security, environmental stewardship, and community connection. I've been investing in sustainable agriculture for the past decade, and your operation, particularly your commitment to donation, aligns perfectly with my goals." It sounded reasonable, almost possible, but years of struggle had taught Mason to look for the catch. "What exactly would you get out of this arrangement?" he asked. "A reasonable return on investment, eventually. The satisfaction of preserving something worthwhile. And more foreign." She glanced at Sophia. "The continuation of a food donation program that has proven exceptionally effective." Mason looked from Eleanor to Sophia and back again. "There's something you're not telling me." Eleanor set down her napkin. "You're perceptive, Mr. Reed." "Yes, there is." She reached into her coat pocket and withdrew an envelope. sliding it across the table. Perhaps this will explain better than I can. With wary fingers, Mason opened the envelope. Inside was a faded photograph of a woman with 2 young children, a boy about 10 and a girl around 6. They stood in front of a modest apartment building, the woman's arms protectively around her children's shoulders. "I don't understand," Mason said, looking up. "The woman in that photo is me," Eleanor said quietly. "Those are my children, James and Diana. That picture was taken 20 years ago, shortly after my husband abandoned us and I lost my job. For 8 months, we survived primarily on food from the Heartland Community Services Food Bank." Mason stared at the photograph, then at the elegant woman before him. The transformation was remarkable, but now that she'd pointed it out, he could see the same determined set to her jaw, the same watchful eyes. "What does this have to do with me?" he asked, though something was beginning to stir in his memory. 20 years ago, Eleanor continued, Heartland received regular donations from a farm outside of town. Reed Family Farms. She looked at him steadily. "Your parents' operation. That food fed my children when I had nothing else to give them." The kitchen fell silent. Mason could hear the old clock ticking on the wall, the distant lowing of cattle in the field. "My father," he said finally, his voice rough. "He always donated, even before I took over." Eleanor nodded. "Those donations kept us alive until I could get back on my feet. I never forgot that. When I eventually built my business and became successful, I tried to find the farm to thank the family personally, but by then, your parents had passed and the farm had changed hands to you." "So this is what, repayment?" Mason asked, uncomfortable with the idea. "No." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "This is investment in something I believe in. Something that saved my family once and continues to save others. The fact that it's your farm is meaningful coincidence, or perhaps something more than coincidence." Sophia spoke up for the first time since they'd sat down. "When I began researching the impact of farm donations, Eleanor's story was one of many I documented. When I realized the connection to your farm specifically, I knew we had to meet you." Mason looked down at the photograph again, trying to reconcile the desperate woman in the image with the composed businesswoman before him. "I'm not a charity case," he said finally, his pride still struggling against the hope rising in his chest. "I'm not offering charity, Mr. Reed," Eleanor said firmly. "I'm offering partnership. Your skill and vision, my capital, both in service of continuing something vital." Thomas, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, cleared his throat. "Son, your father would say a fool looks a gift horse in the mouth, but a wise man checks its teeth. Ask for the terms in writing. Have your lawyer look them over, but don't let pride stand in the way of doing what's right for the farm." Mason met the old man's eyes, seeing in them the same practical wisdom his father had possessed. He nodded slowly, then turned back to Eleanor. "I'll need to see a formal proposal," he said, "and time to consider it." Eleanor smiled, genuine warmth breaking through her reserved demeanor. "Of course. My lawyers will draw up the paperwork immediately." She reached into her bag and produced a business card. "My direct number. Call me with any questions, day or night." As they prepared to leave, Mason walked Eleanor to her vehicle, snow crunching beneath their boots. The winter sun had emerged, making the white landscape almost blindingly bright. "Thank you," Eleanor said, pausing beside her SUV, "for continuing what your parents started. You could have stopped the donations when times got tough. Most would have." Mason shook his head. "Wasn't an option." He hesitated, then added, "I'm glad they helped your family." Eleanor studied him for a moment, then impulsively reached out and squeezed his arm. "They would be proud of you, Mason. Not just for the donations, but for fighting to keep this place alive against impossible odds." The words unlocked something in Mason's chest, a tight, painful knot he'd carried for years. His eyes burned suddenly, and he blinked rapidly against the glare of sun on snow. "Drive safe," was all he could manage to say. After they left, Mason stood in the yard for a long time, watching the empty driveway where their vehicles had disappeared. The winter air filled his lungs, cold and clean, and somehow sweeter than it had been that morning. Thomas joined him, hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. "Well," the old man said, "looks like miracles still happen." Mason nodded, words still beyond him. Something had shifted inside him, a weight lifted, a possibility awakened. "Think I'll check the south fence line," he said finally. "Been meaning to reinforce it before the heavy snows come." Thomas smiled knowingly. "Good thinking. Might need it for those expanded operations." For the first time in years, Mason worked that afternoon with something beyond mere survival driving him. He mended fences with care, imagining new seedlings in spring, School buses full of children coming to learn. Harvests abundant enough to feed hundreds. 2 days later, the paperwork arrived. Mason drove it immediately to Bill Harmon, the lawyer who had handled his parents' estate and knew every inch of the farm's complicated finances. "This is unexpected," Bill said, flipping through the documents in his cluttered office. "But the terms look surprisingly fair. Better than fair, actually." "What's the catch?" Mason asked, perched on the edge of a chair across from the lawyer's desk. Bill adjusted his reading glasses. "As far as I can tell, there isn't one. Ms. Lawrence is offering to clear all outstanding debts, provide operating capital for the next 5 years, and take only a 20% stake in the business. Your donation program would be formalized and expanded, but that seems to be the only real requirement." "That's it? That's it?" Bill removed his glasses, fixing Mason with a serious look. "Son, in 30 years of practice, I've never seen a deal this favorable. If I were you, I'd sign before she changes her mind." Mason did sign, his hand steady as he put his name to paper that would save his family's legacy. But even as relief flooded through him, a small part of him still waited for the other shoe to drop. Life had taught him that nothing came without cost. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Eleanor's team moved quickly, paying off the bank loans, ordering new equipment, hiring contractors to repair the farmhouse roof and update the greenhouse irrigation systems. Mason found himself caught in a whirlwind of planning meetings and decisions, his days suddenly full of possibilities instead of problems. Throughout it all, Sophia was often present, representing Eleanor's interests, but also offering insights of her own. "Have you considered companion planting in the Westfield?" she asked one afternoon as they walked the property, their breath fogging in the January air. "It could increase yield while reducing pest problems." Mason glanced at her with new respect. "You know farming." Sophia smiled, tucking a strand of red hair beneath her wool hat. "My grandparents had a small operation in Minnesota. I spent summers there as a kid." "Is that why you work for the food bank?" Mason asked, curious about this woman who had brought Eleanor into his life. "Partly," she nodded. "I saw how hard my grandparents worked, how precarious farming can be. When they lost their land to developers, it changed something in me, made me want to help preserve what they loved." Mason stopped walking, studying her face. "You could have told me that first day, about Eleanor, about your connection to farming. Would you have believed me?" Sophia asked simply. "Or would you have seen it as charity or worse, pity?" The question struck too close to home. Mason resumed walking, boots crunching through the crusty snow. "Fair point. Besides," Sophia continued, falling into step beside him, "Eleanor wanted to meet you herself, see what kind of man you were before making her decision." "And what kind is that?" Mason asked, not entirely sure he wanted the answer. Sophia considered him for a moment, her green eyes thoughtful. "The kind who gives his best even when he has little to spare. The kind who keeps his promises." She smiled slightly. "The kind worth investing in." Something warm unfurled in Mason's chest, and for once, he didn't try to tamp it down. As winter mellowed into early spring, the farm began to transform. The greenhouse expansions were completed just in time for starting seedlings. The farmhouse repairs made the old place feel solid again, ready to weather another generation. And Mason found himself sleeping through the night for the first time in years. Eleanor visited monthly, her sharp eyes missing nothing but her manner increasingly warm. She never treated Mason as an employee or a charity case, but as a partner whose expertise she valued. "I've been thinking about your mother's idea," she said during a March visit as they stood in the newly renovated barn. "About farms as classrooms." Mason nodded. "I've been in touch with the county schools. They're interested in field trips starting this fall." "Good, but I was thinking bigger." Eleanor's eyes gleamed with the enthusiasm that Mason had come to recognize as her business mind at work. "What about a summer program for underprivileged kids? A week on the farm, learning where food comes from, how to grow it themselves." "That would require infrastructure we don't have," Mason said, though the idea appealed to him. "Housing, bathrooms, staff, details." Eleanor waved dismissively. "The question is, would you want to do it?" Mason thought of his mother, who had always believed that children needed dirt under their fingernails and the satisfaction of growing something themselves. "Yes," he said simply. "I would." Eleanor smiled. "Excellent. I'll have my team draw up proposals." Later that week, as Mason was finishing paperwork at the kitchen table, a task that no longer filled him with dread, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find Sophia standing on the porch, a bottle of wine in one hand and a folder in the other. "Sorry to drop by unannounced," she said, echoing her words from that snowy day months ago. "I was in the area and thought you might want to see these." Mason invited her in, curious. At the table, Sophia opened the folder to reveal photographs, the ones Ben had taken during their first meeting. But these weren't the standard promotional shots Mason had expected. These were art. Black and white images captured the essence of the farm in winter. Mason's hands cupping soil from a greenhouse pot, sunlight streaming through barn slats to illuminate dust motes in perfect beams, Thomas's weathered face in profile against the snow-covered fields. These are, Mason searched for the right word. Beautiful. Ben's a gifted photographer, Sophia agreed. He wanted you to have copies. And she hesitated, then pushed one particular photo forward. This one especially. It was a shot of Mason standing in the doorway of the barn, backlit so his features were in shadow, but his silhouette was perfectly defined. Something about the composition, the solid stance, the set of his shoulders, conveyed strength and perseverance in a way that made Mason's throat tighten. Eleanor has this one framed in her office, Sophia said quietly. She says it reminds her of what determination looks like. Mason looked up, meeting Sophia's eyes. I was drowning that day, he admitted, barely keeping my head above water. I don't feel like that man anymore. You're still him, Sophia said, her gaze steady, just with the burden lifted. They opened the wine, and Mason found himself talking more than he had in years. About his parents, about growing up on the farm, about the dreams he'd set aside during the hard times. Sophia listened with genuine interest, sharing her own stories of urban gardens and food justice work in graduate school. As night fell, they moved to the porch, wrapped in blankets against the spring chill. Stars emerged overhead, brilliant in the clear country sky. Thank you, Mason said into the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Not just for bringing Eleanor, but for seeing something worth saving here. Sophia turned to him, her face half illuminated by the porch light. It was always worth saving, Mason. I'm just glad you're finally seeing it too. On a warm day in late May, Mason stood in the newly expanded East Field, watching the first rows of seedlings reaching toward the sun. Beside him, Thomas surveyed their work with satisfaction. Your father would hardly recognize the place, the old man said, but his tone was approving. All these newfangled irrigation systems and solar panels. Mason smiled. He'd adapt. He always did. That he did, Thomas agreed. Like father, like son. The sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention. Not just one or two, but a caravan turning onto the long driveway. Mason recognized Eleanor's SUV leading the way, followed by several cars and a small bus. Were we expecting company? Thomas asked, brows furrowed. Not that I know of. Mason replied, already striding toward the main yard. Eleanor emerged from her vehicle with a broad smile that immediately put Mason on alert. In his experience, such expressions usually preceded what his father had called grand ideas, the kind that created work for everyone around. Mason, she called, waving him over. Hope you don't mind the surprise visit. I brought some people I'd like you to meet. From the other vehicles poured a diverse group, young and old, families with children, elderly couples, all looking around with interest and oddly recognition. What's going on? Mason asked as he reached Eleanor. These, she said with undisguised pride, are some of the people who have benefited from your family's donations over the years. When I mentioned the farm's expansion and the new educational programs, they wanted to see for themselves. Many of them have become donors to the food bank themselves now. A middle-aged man approached, hand extended. Mr. Reed? I'm James Lawrence, Eleanor's son. Mason shook his hand, recognition dawning. The boy from the photograph, now grown. You saved my childhood, James said simply. Those food boxes meant my mother didn't have to choose between feeding us and keeping the lights on. Before Mason could respond, others came forward. A woman who had fed her 3 children with Reed Farm produce during a medical crisis. An elderly man who had survived a harsh winter when the farm's donations kept the senior center's meals program running. A young couple who had escaped domestic violence with nothing and rebuilt their lives one meal at a time. Story after story washed over Mason, each person describing how food from his family's farm had arrived at a critical moment in their lives. Not just sustenance, but dignity. Hope in a cardboard box. Mason's chest tightened, his father's voice echoing in his memory. We grow more than food here, son. We grow possibility. At the edge of the group, Mason spotted Sophia, camera in hand, capturing the moment with tears gleaming in her eyes. Eleanor stepped forward again, raising her voice to address the gathered crowd. Many of you know that Reed Family Farm nearly closed last year due to financial hardships. Murmurs of concern rippled through the group. What you may not know is that even in those darkest times, Mason never stopped the donations his family had always made. Not once. She turned to Mason, something fierce in her expression. That kind of commitment deserves recognition and support. From behind her, James wheeled forward a large object covered with a cloth. With a dramatic flourish, Eleanor pulled the covering away to reveal a wooden sign, beautifully carved with the words, Reed Family Farm and Educational Center. Growing food, growing community, since 1923. The community has come together, Eleanor announced, to ensure this farm continues its mission for generations to come. Today, I'm pleased to announce that the mortgage on this property has been fully satisfied, and the land returned to the Reed family with no encumbrances. Mason stared at her, uncomprehending. What are you saying? Eleanor smiled, gentler now. I'm saying the investment deal has been restructured. The farm is yours free and clear, Mason. The community will continue to support the educational programs and expanded donations through a newly established foundation, but the land belongs to the Reeds again, as it should. But your stake, Mason began, was always meant to be temporary, Eleanor finished for him. My goal was never ownership, Mason. It was preservation of something vital. The crowd broke into applause, and Mason found himself engulfed in handshakes and hugs from strangers who felt like family. Through it all, he kept catching glimpses of Sophia, her smile radiant as she documented the moment. Later, when the impromptu celebration had moved to the newly renovated barn for a potluck lunch, Mason finally managed to find a quiet moment with Eleanor. Why didn't you tell me this was your plan all along? He asked, still struggling to process the magnitude of her gift. Eleanor considered him thoughtfully. Would you have accepted if you'd known? Probably not, Mason admitted. Exactly, she nodded. Your pride nearly cost you this farm once. I wasn't going to let it happen again. It's too much, Mason said, shaking his head. I can't possibly repay. You already have. Eleanor interrupted firmly. Every donation, every meal, every life changed. She placed a hand on his arm. 20 years ago, your family fed mine when we had nothing. Today, I'm simply closing the circle. Before Mason could respond, James appeared at his mother's side. Mom, the foundation board members want to discuss the summer program schedule with you. Eleanor nodded, then turned back to Mason. We'll talk more later. For now, enjoy your party. You've earned it. As she walked away, Mason felt a presence beside him and turned to find Sophia, her camera temporarily set aside. Did you know? He asked, gesturing toward the celebrating crowd. The new sign, the farm restored to him. Not until last week, she admitted. Eleanor swore me to secrecy. Mason shook his head in wonder. I don't know what to say, what to feel. That's okay, Sophia said softly. Some gifts are too big for words. They stood in comfortable silence watching the gathering. Former food bank recipients now sharing meals with the farmer who had once helped feed them. Children playing in the yard where Mason had played as a boy. Thomas regaling young parents with stories of the farm's history. You know, Sophia said finally, when I first researched your donations, I was looking at numbers. Pounds of produce, families served, nutritional impact. But I never anticipated this. She gestured to the scene before them. Community, healing, full circle moments. Mason nodded, understanding perfectly. He looked out over his land, truly his again, and saw not just fields and buildings, but a living legacy. Not just a farm, but a place of connection and renewal. My mother used to say that the most important crop we grow is the one we never see, he said quietly. The seeds of kindness, planted without expectation of harvest. Sophia's hand found his, warm and certain. Looks like harvest time to me. In the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the fruits of generations of giving, Mason finally allowed himself to believe in the future again. Not just survival, but growth. Not just existence, but purpose. He had given what he could, when he had little to spare, never knowing that a recipient of that generosity would one day return to save everything he loved. The circle completed, but not ended, just widening to embrace new possibilities, new connections, new hope. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields his family had tended for almost a century, Mason Reed stood on land that was now unquestionably his again, surrounded by the community his generosity had helped build. And for the first time in years, he felt his parents' presence not as a weight of expectation, but as a gentle affirmation. This is what we began. This is what you continued. This is what will grow beyond us all.